The presidency of Franklin Roosevelt from 1933 to 1945 marked a critical period in the relationship between the Jewish community and the U.S. government. FDR's era spanned the Great Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, the onset of World War II, and the Holocaust, events that dramatically impacted Jewish communities worldwide. The complex relationship between the Jewish community and the Roosevelt administration was shaped by domestic concerns, foreign policy, the looming crisis in Europe, and FDR's personal attitudes towards Jewish issues. Jewish Americans overwhelmingly supported Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal policies during the 1930s. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, had a profound impact on all Americans, including Jewish communities. Many Jews, particularly immigrants and working-class Jews, were affected by unemployment, poverty, and economic hardship. The New Deal programs, which aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform, resonated with Jewish voters, who saw Roosevelt as a champion of social justice and economic equality. Roosevelt's Democratic Party became the political home for many Jews who had previously aligned with the Republican Party, especially in the early 20th century. FDR's advocacy for social welfare programs, his commitment to labor rights, and his efforts to combat economic inequality appealed to Jewish immigrants and second-generation Jewish Americans, many of whom were involved in labor movements, social activism, and progressive causes. In the 1932 election, FDR received substantial support from Jewish voters, a trend that continued throughout his presidency. In the 1936 election, it is estimated that more than 80% of Jewish voters supported Roosevelt, reflecting the strong bond between the Jewish community and the New Deal coalition. This political alliance was not only based on economic policy, but also on the perception that Roosevelt's administration was committed to protecting civil liberties and fighting discrimination. While FDR enjoyed broad support from Jewish Americans domestically, his foreign policy regarding the growing threat of fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe was a source of increasing concern for Jewish leaders. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany in 1933 marked the beginning of an era of escalating persecution against Jews in Europe. Jewish communities in the United States closely followed the events unfolding in Germany, including the passage of the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, which stripped Jews of their citizenship and civil rights, and the violence of Kristallnacht in 1938, during which Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked. American Jews were alarmed by these developments and sought to mobilize public opinion and government action to address the plight of Jews in Europe. Jewish advocacy organizations such as the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and the Jewish Labor Committee became more active in lobbying the Roosevelt administration to take a stand against Nazi anti-Semitism. These organizations held rallies, published reports, and sought to raise awareness about the dangers posed by the Nazi regime. Despite the growing urgency of the situation, Roosevelt's administration was cautious in its response to the Nazi threat, particularly in the early years of his presidency. FDR was deeply concerned with the isolationist sentiment that pervaded American politics in the 1930s, especially in the wake of World War I. Many Americans were opposed to involvement in European conflicts, and there was little political appetite for intervention. Additionally, anti-Semitic and xenophobic attitudes in the United States, coupled with strict immigration quotas, limited the ability of Jewish refugees to escape to the U.S. One of the most contentious issues during FDR's presidency was the U.S. government's immigration policy and its impact on Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. The Immigration Act of 1924 had established strict quotas that severely limited the number of immigrants who could enter the United States from certain countries, particularly those in Eastern and Southern Europe, where many Jews lived. These quotas remained in place during the Roosevelt administration, despite growing pressure to allow more Jewish refugees to enter the country. In the 1930s, Jewish organizations in the U.S. lobbied the Roosevelt administration to relax immigration restrictions and provide refuge for Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. However, these efforts were met with resistance from both the administration and Congress. Public opinion in the United States was largely opposed to increasing immigration, particularly during the economic hardship of the Great Depression. Additionally, anti-Semitic and nativist sentiments were prevalent in American society, and many feared that an influx of Jewish refugees would lead to increased competition for jobs and resources. One of the most infamous episodes during this period was the fate of the SS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees from Germany in 1939. The ship was denied entry to the United States and other countries in the Western Hemisphere, forcing it to return to Europe, where many of the passengers later perished in the Holocaust. This incident became a symbol of the U.S. government's reluctance to provide refuge to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. Despite these challenges, some Jews were able to find refuge in the United States during the 1930s. FDR's administration did make limited efforts to assist certain groups of refugees, particularly intellectuals, artists, and scientists fleeing the Nazis. Notably, the administration facilitated the entry of prominent Jewish intellectuals and scientists, including Albert Einstein, who fled Europe to escape the rise of fascism. However, these efforts were the exception rather than the rule. Overall, the U.S. government's immigration policies during the 1930s and early 1940s were widely criticized by Jewish leaders and historians for failing to respond adequately to the Jewish refugee crisis. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 and the subsequent escalation of Nazi atrocities against Jews marked a turning point in the relationship between the Jewish community and the U.S. government. As reports of mass murder and genocide began to reach the United States, Jewish organizations intensified their efforts to push the Roosevelt administration to take more decisive action. However, the U.S. government's response to the Holocaust was slow and often inadequate. In 1942, the U.S. government received confirmed reports of the Nazi regime's plan to exterminate Europe's Jewish population, known as the Final Solution. Jewish leaders, including Rabbi Stephen Wise, one of the most prominent Jewish figures in America, urged the Roosevelt administration to take action to stop the genocide. Wise and other Jewish leaders advocated for the bombing of concentration camps, the establishment of safe havens for Jewish refugees, and the creation of a rescue agency to assist Jews fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. Despite these efforts, the Roosevelt administration's response to the Holocaust was limited. The U.S. government was primarily focused on the broader war effort, and many officials, including those in the State Department, were skeptical of the feasibility of rescue operations. There were also concerns about domestic anti-Semitism and the potential backlash against Roosevelt's administration if it appeared to be giving special treatment to Jewish refugees. One notable development during this period was the creation of the War Refugee Board in 1944. The WRB, established under pressure from Jewish organizations and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, was tasked with coordinating efforts to rescue Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. While the WRB did help save tens of thousands of Jews, its establishment came too late to prevent the deaths of millions of Jews in the Holocaust. FDR's personal views on Jewish issues have been the subject of considerable debate among historians. Some argue that Roosevelt was sympathetic to the plight of Jews and supported efforts to combat anti-Semitism, while others contend that his administration's policies were shaped by political pragmatism and a reluctance to challenge prevailing anti-Semitic attitudes. Roosevelt had close relationships with several prominent Jewish figures, including Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau, in particular, played a key role in advocating for Jewish refugees and pushing the Roosevelt administration to take action against the Holocaust. However, Roosevelt's broader administration, particularly the State Department, was often indifferent or hostile to Jewish concerns. Key figures in the State Department, such as Breckinridge Long, were instrumental in maintaining restrictive immigration policies and delaying efforts to rescue Jews from Nazi-occupied Europe. FDR's public statements on Jewish issues were often vague and cautious. While he condemned Nazi atrocities and expressed sympathy for the victims of persecution, he rarely took bold or decisive action to address the Jewish refugee crisis. Some historians argue that Roosevelt was constrained by the political realities of the time, including the strong isolationist sentiment in Congress and the presence of anti-Semitism within the U.S. population.